By 2035, Singapore won't just be a small country with a big economy. It will be sitting in the middle of what many analysts quietly call the most dangerous triangle of power on Earth. Triangle shaped by America's rivalry, China's rise, and Australia's new strategic ambitions. And here's the part nobody says out loud. Every major power wants Singapore on their side. Not because of its land size, not because of its military, but because controlling influence over Singapore means controlling one of the world's most important choke points and one of the world's most trusted financial hubs. Yet this creates a paradox so sharp it could cut the country in half. Singapore's entire identity, its growth, its stability, its survival depends on staying in the middle. Neutral, balanced, trusted by all, and owned by none. But 2035 is shaping up differently. Superpowers are becoming impatient. Alliances are becoming harder. Neutrality is becoming a risk. So the question Singapore has avoided for decades, the question nobody wants to ask, is now impossible to ignore. Can Singapore keep playing all sides? Or will the world finally force it to choose? Why everyone wants Singapore? If you zoom out from the headlines and look at the map, the way strategists do, something becomes obvious. Singapore is not just a country, it's a game board. And in 2035, that game board has become more valuable than ever. Start with geography. Singapore sits precisely where the Indian Ocean squeezes into the Pacific, the only gateway where east meets west in a single shipping lane. This tiny stretch of water is responsible for a massive portion of global trade. Oil, food, and electronics. Raw materials, everything passes through this narrow blue corridor. And Singapore doesn't just sit next to it. It controls the choke point, then shift to finance. After decades of political instability across Asia, global investors needed a safe home base, a place that doesn't bend easily to foreign pressure, doesn't collapse, and doesn't play emotional politics. Singapore became exactly that, Asia's financial firewall. If China gets unpredictable, money flows to Singapore. If the US becomes chaotic, money flows to Singapore. If Europe slows down, money flows to Singapore. In a world full of uncertainty, Singapore became the one country everyone could trust. The West trusts its stability. China trusts its neutrality. And both sides trust Singapore not to embarrass them on the world stage. But neutrality is not weakness. It's leverage. And by 2035, Singapore is the rare nation that is neutral enough to talk to everyone, and important enough that no one can ignore it. This leads to the real mid-hook truth. The truth most people never see. The competition for Singapore isn't about friendship. It's about leverage. And the more valuable Singapore becomes, the more pressure it faces from all sides. The Australia pivot. For most of history, Australia played defense, a comfortable, distant observer watching Asia from across the sea. But by 2035, that strategy collapses. China's power has grown too quickly. The global economy depends too heavily on Asian supply chains, and climate and security risks are pushing nations to rethink everything. So Australia makes a pivot, a fast, strategic, and surprisingly bold one. The first reason is supply chains. Australia realized that depending on faraway partners makes it vulnerable. It needs a reliable Asian connector, a place that's stable, efficient, and geopolitically balanced. Singapore becomes the obvious candidate. The one Asian nation that can plug Australia into the region without pulling it into China's orbit. Then there's AUKUS, the military pact with the US and the UK. Australia is quietly building one of the most advanced defense networks in the world. But advanced weapons don't matter without a strategic choke point, and Singapore sits on the most valuable one in the Indo-Pacific. Australia also sees what's happening in the South China Sea. China isn't expanding territory, it's expanding influence. And influence is harder to stop. It surrounds nations not with tanks, but with trade, ports, and debt. So Australia starts looking for allies that can counterbalance that soft power. Not with force, but with access. With geography, with credibility. That's why Singapore matters. Because Singapore isn't just neutral, it's respected. It can speak to China without fear, and speak to the West without apology. That makes it the perfect strategic bridge Australia desperately needs. Here's the subtle shift nobody talks about. Australia isn't trying to compete with China's size. It can't. No one can. In 2035, Australia is competing for something else entirely. Relevance. Staying important. staying connected, staying in the game. And Singapore is the partner that keeps Australia in that game. The U.S. relationship. For decades, the United States has viewed Singapore as something incredibly rare in Asia, a stabilizer in a region full of shifting alliances and unpredictable neighbors. To Washington, Singapore is the country that doesn't panic, doesn't flip sides, and doesn't break its word. And in geopolitics, that kind of consistency is priceless. Singapore is also a launch pad, a strategic foothold in Southeast Asia where American ships refuel, American companies base their operations, and American diplomacy gets a level-headed voice to help them understand the region. When Washington needs to translate its intentions into something Southeast Asia can actually accept, it often goes through Singapore. Economically, the relationship is even deeper. The U.S. knows that if China becomes unpredictable, politically, militarily, or financially, global investors will run. And they won't run to Tokyo or Hong Kong. They run to Singapore, the one place that feels safe when every other place feels uncertain. But by 2035, the U.S.-Singapore relationship is drifting into a more complicated phase. Not because of hostility, but because of expectations. First, American foreign policy keeps getting reset with every election cycle. One president wants alliances, the next wants isolation, another wants pressure, another wants cooperation. For a small nation like Singapore, this constant rotation requires delicate balancing and sometimes quiet resistance. Second, the U.S. is entering an era where it wants clearer alliances, less ambiguity, more with us or against us. But Singapore doesn't play that game. It never has. Its entire survival depends on staying neutral enough to trade with China, work with America, and avoid becoming anyone's satellite. And that leads to the biggest tension point of all. Singapore refuses, absolutely refuses, to become Asia's mini-US. This frustrates Washington more than they admit, because deep down the U.S. likes Singapore. Until Singapore says no. The China pressure. If America represents expectations, China represents pressure. No country shapes Singapore's future more than China, and no relationship is more complicated, more sensitive, or more misunderstood by the outside world. Start with the obvious. China is Singapore's #1 trading partner. The factories, the logistics networks, the regional supply chains, almost all of Southeast Asia's economic bloodstream runs through China in one way or another. If China slows down, Singapore feels it. If China grows, Singapore benefits. And if China becomes unpredictable, Singapore becomes vulnerable. But the pressure goes beyond trade. In the South China Sea, China isn't simply increasing military presence, it's expanding influence. Artificial islands, new naval bases, security deals with neighboring countries. Each move quietly shifts the balance of power closer to Beijing and closer to Singapore's front door. Then there's nationalism. By 2035, China's domestic politics have become more assertive, more vocal, and far less patient. A rising belief inside Beijing says, if you are not with us, you are against us. That's a problem for Singapore, a country built on the opposite philosophy. Everyone can be us. But China sees neutrality as a form of strategic ambiguity. And strategic ambiguity, to Beijing, feels like disloyalty. This creates a silent dilemma that Singapore rarely talks about publicly. How long can Singapore maintain a balanced relationship when China is becoming less willing to accept balance at all? Here's the hidden truth viewers don't realize. China doesn't want Singapore to choose America. It doesn't even want Singapore to choose China. It wants Singapore to behave in a way that signals alignment, even without formal alliances. But if Singapore does that, it loses the trust of the West. If it refuses, it risks the quiet but powerful consequences China can unleash. Economic pressure, slowed investment, reduced market access. In other words, China doesn't need Singapore to pick a side. It only needs Singapore to fear picking the wrong one.